Daniel. I chose to do the whole book of Daniel rather than focus on a story. And that has caused me headaches all week. But there's value in this overview, because when we look at Daniel's life overall, we can learn something. Now, the stories are great. All those are really awesome, and we could take a couple weeks on each of the stories. But to step back and say, what was it that made Daniel significant? What was it that made him a person of influence in a world that needed it? We have to start by understanding where Daniel's world was. He was a captive. He was not home anymore. He was in a foreign land. John and Barb Vandermolen recently took a trip to Egypt. I know many of us who are friends with them on Facebook saw some pictures of Barb on a camel and some great pyramids and all kinds of really cool stuff. And this week, John and I happened to be talking about their trip and how it was, and the conversation turned to faith, because that's what we do. And one of the things he took away from that trip was how pluralistic the worldview of the Egyptians was, how they worshiped everything. They worshiped the sun and the river and gods to help make the grain grow. They worshiped cats. They worshiped anything. If it might help make their life better, they would worship it. Now contrast that to Daniel and what he believed. Daniel and his friends came from a place where they believed that there is no God but Jehovah. There is one God. And so when they came to Babylon, because Babylon was very much like Egypt was in their mode of worship, they would worship anything. The king could be an object of worship. So foreign to our thinking, but very, very foreign to Daniel's thinking as well. And then I look at our world, and I say, what do we worship now? What is, not we as in this place, but how does our world approach life? Well, you know what? They chase after anything they think can make their life better. In Daniel's world, it might have been a different God, but in our world, it's wealth or power or the right spouse or insert thing here. Money. Just a good time. We live in a pluralistic world. And if you think it just isn't just the secular world that's that way, look at the religious world. Well, all paths point to God, don't they? All religions basically say the same thing, don't they? I listened to watched a video of the Dalai Lama recently. Here's the head of one of the major faiths of the world, and basically that was what he was saying. All the major religions believe the same thing. A couple weeks ago, Pastor Chuck very eloquently laid out the biblical view of that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by him. And I loved that he got in the end to, that's a statement of grace, of openness, not of condemnation. That's a statement of hope, that you don't have to be good enough. God loves you anyway, and he opens his arms to you anyway. He was good enough so you don't have to be. Amen? So Daniel's world really wasn't that much different than ours. He found himself in a country alone, believing things that people didn't understand. So how can we be people of influence in a world like Daniel's that thinks that our belief system, the things we know to be true as followers of Christ, that they look at that and they just can't understand it? I want to unpack this and explore this by looking at Daniel's relationship to the three major kings. The three major kings he had interactions with. And the first was Nebuchadnezzar. First was Nebuchadnezzar, and it's kind of the first 4 chapters in Daniel talk about his relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. And I'm going to give you 4 principles this morning. 4 principles this morning, one out of each of the chapters, one out of each story. Out of chapter 1, the principle is this, and I'm going to give you the principle up front, and then we're going to talk about it, okay? But in chapter 1, the principle is this: to be a person of influence, humbly follow God's patterns and not the world's. Humbly follow God's patterns and not the world's. Daniel and his friends refused to eat the food and drink that was presented to them by their captors. They refused to adapt to the mold around them. And yet look at the manner in which they did it. In chapter 1, verse 8 of Daniel, we read this: Daniel decided not to make himself unclean by eating the king's food and drinking his wine. So he asked the chief official for a favor. He asked him for a favor. He wanted permission not to make himself unclean with the king's food and wine. He stood up for what he believed in, but he did it with humility and graciousness. Chapter 2. Chapter 2, we have the story of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. The first dream with the statue that the rock comes and hits it. The principle out of this is communicate carefully and seek God's wisdom. So principle 1 out of chapter 1 is humbly follow God's pattern and not the world's. Principle 2, communicate carefully and seek God's wisdom. He had the dream, and Nebuchadnezzar was so angry that his wise men couldn't interpret his dream, couldn't tell him his dream. He was so angry that he said, kill them all. Just get rid of them. They're just fakers. None of them is true. None of them has any real power. They can't tell this to me. Verse 13, it reads, so the order was given to kill them. Men were sent out to look for Daniel and his friends. They were also supposed to be put to death. Arioch was the commander of the king's guard. He went out to put the wise men of Babylon to death. So Daniel spoke to him wisely and carefully. Again, wisely and carefully. He didn't speak arrogantly and said, I can do this, but with wisdom and carefully. And then he took some time. If you read the story, he actually said, give me a little bit of time to seek God's will. So he sought God's will. And he came up with the answer. And because of that, he was blessed. He was honored. Wise speech, careful communication, seeking God's wisdom. In chapter 3, we have the story that they just sang about, the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The principle here is keep God first, even when it's hard. Sometimes life puts us in situations that it's difficult to follow God's will. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego responded to the king this way. They talked about it in the song. King Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to talk about this anymore. We might be thrown into the blazing furnace, but the God we serve is able to bring us out of it alive. He will save us from your powerful hand. And this is the thing that struck me this week as I was working with this. But we want you to know this. Even if we knew that our God wouldn't save us, even if we knew we were going to die in this furnace, we still wouldn't serve your gods. We wouldn't worship the gold statue you set up. Even if we know we're going to die, we're going to follow God's will. Keep God first, even when it's hard. For many of us, it's not that we're confronted with blatant things forcing us to do evil. It's that we let the clutter of life squeeze God out. We let the busyness of life squeeze him out and force us down another path. And in chapter 4, our final chapter with Nebuchadnezzar, Our principle comes down to this: compassionately speak truth to power. Compassionately speak truth to power. Nebuchadnezzar had that dream, and he asked Daniel, "Come and interpret it for me." And Daniel was troubled. He was bewildered for a while, the text says. His thoughts terrified him. So the king said, "Belteshazzar," that was the Babylonian name for Daniel, "don't let this dream or its meaning make you afraid." So Belteshazzar answered, "My master, I wish this dream was about your enemies. I wish its meaning had to do with them. I have to communicate truth to you, but I'm communicating it with compassion here. I really wish you wouldn't have to go through this. But this is the truth. Because truth is truth. And in Nebuchadnezzar's case, he was going to fall from the highest height to the lowest of the land. He was literally going insane and would eat grass like an animal. And at the end of the chapter, we read, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, give praise and honor and glory to the King of heaven. Everything he does is right. All of his ways are fair. He's able to bring down those who live proudly." We see at the end, the thing that cleared Nebuchadnezzar's mind was a decision to follow God. The world can cloud our minds with all kinds of things. And when we keep an eye on Him, clarity comes and grace is offered. So as I wrap up this first section, I want to go over those principles and point out something. Again, I gave you 4 principles out of the chapter. Follow God's pattern, not the world's. Seek God's wisdom. Keep God first even when it's hard. And speak truth to power. But those are not just commands. They come with attributes, with descriptors. We need to not just follow God's pattern and not the world's. We need to humbly follow God's pattern and not the world's. We need to not just seek God's wisdom, but we need to communicate carefully as we seek God's wisdom. We need to not just speak truth to power, but compassionately speak truth to power. I've been troubled through this election season. Anybody else? But what's troubled me is the church. That as we try to hold to our convictions, as we try to hold to God's truth, as we try to hold to the principles of what is right and wrong and true, often we forget the attributes. We're following God's ways, and yet we're doing it with anger and bitterness. We're doing it by tearing the other down. That's not what we're called to do. It's not who we're called to be, because God cares not only about your actions, but about your heart. And a heart that reflects Jesus reflects humility and compassion and gentleness. Are we too worried about changing Washington and not worried enough about connecting with the people around us? Washington will not save their souls. And yet, will our speech draw them to Christ or push them away? Will our speech, our actions, our attitudes allow us to be people of influence, or will they turn people away from the grace of the gospel? We may win the argument and lose the war. The next chapter, chapter 5, we see Nebuchadnezzar's son, Belshazzar, come. And Belshazzar, he was a pampered son of the king. He was a rich kid who had everything he wanted. Every whim was met at a moment's notice. And Belshazzar decided to have a party with his friends And as I said in the story, during the midst of that party, they thought it would be fun to bring out the goblets from the temple. Let's have a laugh here, guys. And those holy objects that had been taken out of God's house were contaminated. And in the middle of it, a hand appears on the wall writing. And as you would expect, as it would happen to us if that happened today, it would scare me. It scared him. It shocked him to his core. And he asked first his circle of wise men, and no one had an answer for what it meant. And so he reached out and said, hey, where can I get any help? And someone remembered that guy named Daniel. That guy named Daniel. See, when we are a person of influence, when we're a person of grace, when we've built trust with those around us, that builds a reputation. It builds a reputation of people. And someone said, hey, let's get Daniel. Maybe he can help. And so Daniel came in. Daniel did not have good words for Belshazzar because Belshazzar's heart was hard. I'm going to read much of the chapter here because these words are better than mine. He says, then Daniel answered the king. He said, you can keep your gifts that you offered for yourself. You can give your rewards to someone else, but I will read the writing for you. I will tell you what it means. King Belshazzar, the Most High God, was good to your father Nebuchadnezzar. He gave him authority, greatness, and glory and honor. God gave him a high position, and then all of the people from every nation and language became afraid of the king. He put to death anyone he wanted to. He spared anyone he wanted to spare. He gave high positions to anyone he wanted and brought down anyone he wanted to bring down. But his heart had become stubborn and proud, so he was removed from his throne. His glory was stripped away. He was driven away from the people. He was given the mind of an animal. He lived like a wild donkey, ate grass just as the cattle do. His body became wet with the dew of heaven. He stayed in that way until he recognized that the Most High God rules over all the kingdoms of men. He puts anyone he wants to in charge of them. But you knew that, Belshazzar. You knew your father's story. In spite of that, you are still proud. You've taken your stand against the Lord of heaven. You had your servants bring cups from his temple to you. You and your nobles drank wine from them. So did your wives and your concubines. You praised your gods. The statues of these gods are made out of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, or stone. They can't see or understand anything, but you didn't honor the God who holds in his hand your very life and everything you do. You've chased after all these things, and you know what that means? If you refuse to honor the God who made you, you will die. You will die. Belshazzar, the king, honored his promise. He gave Daniel purple clothes, put a chain around his neck. He declared that he would be the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And then that very night, the king of Babylon was overthrown and killed by Darius. That very night, he died. I want to contrast that to King Darius. And we'll go back and wrap this up in a moment. Because Darius is the new king. He comes in and he sees Daniel's work. And he keeps Daniel as one of those three leaders in the kingdom. That's kind of unfathomable to me, that a new king would come in, overthrow the government, and keep some of the leaders in place. But he did. He kept Daniel as one of those 3 leaders. And Daniel did so well that he was going to make him second in command only to himself over everything in the kingdom. And the other leaders said, we can't let this happen. And they plotted against him. And they convinced Darius to make that law, for everyone to worship and pray only to him. They knew that according to the law of the land, once he made the law, he could not change it. He could not change it. And so when Daniel refused to change his principles, refused to change from the person he had from a young man decided he was going to be, they figured, we got him. We couldn't find a trick, or we couldn't find any weakness in his work. So the only way we can get him is through his faith. The only way we can get him through his faith. In fact, those men said this in verse 5 of chapter 6. They said, it's almost impossible for us to come up with a reason to bring charges against this man Daniel. Almost impossible. If we do, it'll have to be in connection with the law of his God. Satan introduced a new trick in the playbook. Let's make holiness illegal. Let's change the law of the land. This is not the first time Satan's used the tactic, nor was it the last. It parallels the fiery furnace story. But in reality, even in today's world, there are places in this world where you cannot name the name of Christ without being thrown to the proverbial lions. We are still a faith under attack because it is not opposed in this world. The beast of the world is still alive and well, and we have convinced ourselves that he is not. Because we can worship. We can come here, right? Today. We don't know what the future holds. But like the children in the fiery furnace, will we do what's right even when it's hard? So Daniel got thrown in the lion's den, and the lions' mouths were shut. And the next morning, Darius runs to the edge, and he sees if his friend, the man he respects, was still alive. And he is. And he rescues Daniel from the lions, and he throws the perpetrators to their deaths. In chapters 5 and 6, we have the contrast of 2 kings. The contrast of 2 kings, both of them confronted with a situation where they could either honor God or not. Darius was tricked, sure, but at the end, he said, God's law is the law. God's word, the God of Daniel is the God of the universe. And he honored him. Whereas Belshazzar, confronted with this whole legacy of his father's story, still had a hard heart. The reality is that as people of influence, we can only be the people God has called us to be. We can only have the conversations God has called us to have. And at that point, there are people who will choose not to believe. Does that mean we cease to be people of influence? Does that mean we just throw it away and say, I'm going to just withdraw into my own world and do my own thing? No. We are called to go. We are called to tell God, to show God's love to a world who needs it. The end of the book, as I said earlier, contains Daniel's own visions and dreams. And ultimately, we see that bigger picture. that bigger picture, that the beast is still alive and well in this world. And things are not going to get better for a while. There are dark days ahead for people of faith. But God, I love that. But God is still in control. And one day, the King will come. One day the King will come and he will save his people. Ultimately, I want to end with this thought. That as people of influence, we must be people of the Word. We must know what God's Word says about who we are and who we are to be. We must know what His principles are, and we must live them out. That's what Daniel did. But we also must do it with the right manner. In the New Testament we read, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control." So as you go through your life, are you someone who knows and clings to God's principles? And as you do it, do you do it with kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control? That's what it takes to be a person of influence. That's the model of Daniel. That's what's going to save our families and our community and our country and our world. Clinging to God's principles, holding them high, not letting the world wash us and push us into its mold, and yet also doing it with that spirit that God has put in us. I'm going to have the worship team come. We're going to end by singing "Be Thou My Vision." It's one of my favorite songs.